Shows that are meant for adolescents are typically lighthearted, but sometimes they miss the mark. Whether that's intentional or not depends on the show, but they all have the same effect. They unsettle you. All of today's subjects are viewer suggested, and if you want to suggest things yourself, make sure to hit up my social media link below. Now, let's get into some unsettling shows. And, if you're wondering about the title, Blame It on Jorge got blasted, so I'm trying to keep a certain word out of it.
Well, now that we've got your attention, let the games begin!
Crashbox is a title I noticed pop up multiple times. After looking into it, I realized that it brought back some vague memories, but I was surprised that more people hadn't mentioned it before. Crashbox is an educational show that aired for 2 seasons on the HBO channel starting in 1999. The entire show consists of short educational games of varying length. Now that may sound a little odd. How can a premise like this come off as at all unsettling? Well, it's kinda like a real-life Candle Cove? That's not necessarily the best way to put it, but it has a very similar aesthetic. A lot of the characters have a vintage look to them that reminds some of the story. One character in particular that's very similar is Captain Bones. Just looking at him may have immediately reminded you of Candle Cove. His segment in the show is pretty tame, kind of. Basically, he breaks his body apart and uses his bones to create simple math problems. They always have something wrong at first, and of course you as the viewer are supposed to solve it. Speaking of the segments, let's talk about some creepier ones. The good old revolting slob is the first one up, and let me tell you, if you're unsettled by gross things, then this may terrify you. The narrator will basically ask the viewer what word best describes what the slob is eating or doing. The slob does look kind of creepy as well, especially his little teeth. Ugh. Since I'm not analyzing the whole show, I'll only talk about one more segment, the haunted house party. The segment begins with some sinister music as the camera pans up to the haunted house, with the narrator welcoming you. On the left of this clip, you may have also noticed a clay figure holding its head. It kind of reminds me of the Scream painting, or of something else.
We'll have a storm now, and an earthquake if you like. For I do not know what it is.
Anyway, right. The segment is about identifying specific historical figures based on clues they give while they talk to someone else in the house. I really like the aesthetic of this segment. The creepy house, claymation monsters, and shadowed figures walking by the windows of the house all could make the younger me pretty unsettled. Although the education is simple, I highly recommend Crashbox for anyone that wants to watch some content with this aesthetic. The segments are well made, and the Candle Cove aura it gives off at times is purely authentic, which adds to the atmosphere. Oh boy, Poppy the Performer. You know what? I would try to describe this show, but I think playing you a short clip from episode 1 will work. Now with that clip you've just seen, imagine you're around 10 years old. I think that's really all I need to say, but I'm obviously going to say more. Poppy the Performer was a show released on Japan's kids station and was actually written by a husband and wife. Not sure if they've ever interacted with a child before considering what they made, but I respect the effort. There are 39 episodes of this show spanning across multiple seasons. Every episode follows Poppy trying to learn a new performing skill. In season 1 we have things like magic, fire breathing, karate, and escape artistry. I'm not sure who was actually able to see this as a kid, but I'm genuinely interested as to if it scared you or not. Maybe it's so absurd that no child would actually be creeped out by it at all, I don't know. Now obviously the animation and overall imagery is the entire reason as to why the show was on this list. Now some of the moments in this show are absolutely insane, like for example when Poppy is fighting this sun guy who proceeds to throw the moon at the earth like this is Majora's Mask, only for Poppy to catch the entire moon and balance it on their head. I'm not even joking. But others are genuinely unnerving, like the episode Dark Side. Obviously this episode is about a dark side of the circus that the characters want to explore. When going into the dark side, it of course makes them act dark. So we get imagery like this. I think this really sums up exactly why I chose to talk about this show today. The quality of the animation and background also genuinely just make things feel very empty, very similar to a liminal space. Now if after all of that you happen to want to watch this show, you can find it right here on YouTube. The entire show lasts just under 3 hours, so you may be able to binge it after this video.
There is a scientific way to get rid of tapeworms.
Ah, Mr. Meaty. The show best known for the tapeworm episode. I'm sure many of you are familiar with said episode, but if you're not, Moochmaster P is about Parker going around and eating everyone's food because of course, he's asking to take a bite and therefore mooching off of them. Eventually, he accidentally eats a raw burger and contracts a tapeworm. Now if all of this wasn't bad enough, we get to see them fish the tapeworm right out of him. Speaking of this scene, this portion right here is crazy.
And approach the sausage. Gotcha.
Now of course there's more, like how the Australian guy at the end literally swallows the tapeworm whole, or how near the beginning Parker does this creepy saliva thing and also covers the mall cop's hand in saliva after eating his donut, which was great. Of course, I'm talking about an entire show, so let's move on to some common tropes that exist in all of the episodes. First of all, we have the character designs. I think that cheap puppets freak a lot of people out, a good example of this being Peppermint Park. But with Mr. Meaty, the characters seem almost meant to look grotesque in a way. Like, I mean, look at these characters. Second of all, I would say just the general gross out scenes. They have a tendency to always take things as far as they can go, like Ren and Stimpy or season 6 through 8 SpongeBob. An example, outside of the saliva thing, would be an episode where Parker and a goth girl both deep fry their own hands and literally eat them. Yes, this is not a creepypasta, this is 100% real, and you can find this full clip on YouTube itself. In other words, it's a very weird, and sometimes very gross show that can easily unsettle younger people and even sometimes creep out adults if it wants to. Some really don't like the series, but I think it has its charms, so as I've kept saying, if you like it, check it out.
1, 2, 3, see me water carefully.
I'm sure some of you have heard of the 1999 creepypasta. It's a classic story in which the main character stumbles upon a creepy kid show on a local channel. The host is a man dressed in a cheap bear suit and, well, a lot of not so good things end up happening. One of those things involving the kids that participate in the show. This may sound a bit irrelevant, but it actually is a perfect segue into this section's subject. Big Dog is a show that, from what I could gather, was shown in the 80s and 90s on a Newcastle TV network called NBN. It's a pretty simple show as well. Basically, the host and Big Dog will participate in a set of games and songs with a group of kids. For example, in one segment, the kids have to balance beanbags on their heads while walking on this stick. Now, before we get to Big Dog, I want to talk about an aspect of the show that really creeped me out personally. There's pretty much zero background noise, save for that staticky feedback that most programs from that time had. Of course, they do sing and do other things, so it's not as if it's completely silent, but the lack of any background sound gives off this really empty feeling. It almost gives me the aura that the kids were forced to be there, even though their parents were just off screen. When relating that back to the creepypasta I talked about earlier, it just gives me this uneasy feeling. Honestly, if you want to see what I'm talking about, you should check it out. You can find it right here on YouTube. That being said though, Big Dog is the other reason that I think this would be pretty scary for kids. He's not super terrifying by any means, but a lot of people don't like mascots at all, and the cheaper costume could unnerve a lot of people. Yup, Pomple and Pilt. Otherwise known as The Repairmen Are Coming, this show was created in 1969 by Arne and Bjorg Mikkel, I guess. The series has only 5 episodes and was aired on several different occasions. Because of its lack of logical and psychological content, it was not only criticized by child psychologists, but eventually deemed not suitable for children by the NRK or Norwegian Broadcasting Corporation. Speaking of psychology, this show also brought on a different type of psychological response. Fear. Just looking through the comments on any episode put onto YouTube shows that many people have this sentiment. This show is very dark, and by that I specifically mean the background. A lot of empty background space is taken up by pure darkness no matter what time of day it's supposed to be or where they're at. It always looks super dark and empty, and of course the fact that the show in general doesn't have any color isn't very helpful. The puppets in the show are also pretty cheaply made, which as always not only could hit some parts of the uncanny valley, but could also just generally set off people that have a fear of puppets. Along with that, a lot of the show has a lack of background noise. This adds to the already blank dark background and makes this show seem even more empty and unsettling, like it's just somewhere you don't want to be. Maybe I also get that feeling because of a certain Mickey Mouse creepypasta, who really knows. Goosebumps is something that I watched a lot of, and I'm sure that many of you watched it as well. I can remember being so afraid of one of the Haunted Mask episodes that I literally ran out of the room, but looking back on it, the show is much more cheesy than anything else. That's where The Haunting Hour comes in. The Haunting Hour was a show that ran from 2010 to 2014. It was also created by, you guessed it, R.L. Stine, the same guy that of course created Goosebumps. This show is similar to Goosebumps in the fact that children are the main characters, but the stories these episodes have and the way they pan out is a little bit different. An example is the Pumpkinhead episode. The YouTuber Pushing Up Roses covered this episode in detail, so I recommend you check their video out, but I'll briefly explain the premise. Long story short, these 3 kids go to a pumpkin patch to steal a pumpkin. However, they end up entering a barn with creepy pumpkin-headed dummies. Eventually, they're able to take some pumpkins and leave. A couple of days later, one of the kids gets kidnapped and later has his head chopped off and replaced with a pumpkin, and the same happens to another kid before they approach the car with the last one inside. It's presumed that he suffers the same fate. Now obviously that is a stark difference from the typically wacky and ambiguous Goosebumps endings. It's much more dark and doesn't try to be as fantastical as the former series. I'd be lying if I said that Goosebumps didn't have some creepy concepts, but the way The Haunting Hour goes about things is just different. Another personal example of mine is from the episode Really You Part 2, wherein the main girl starts to have her body parts literally replaced with doll parts. I can only imagine the type of visceral horror you'd experience if you were able to watch your appendages slowly transform into plastic pieces, losing feeling and becoming immovable even though you had no way to stop it. If you're a fan of Goosebumps, I highly recommend you check this show out. This won't be the last episode, so don't worry if your suggestion didn't get picked. Thanks for watching, and have a good day.